Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And a lot of this was me thinking through and pulling on the histories of what happens in the industrial world, right, with industrialization early on, and how that changes as people are moving from agrarian lifestyles and places and moving into these urban spaces, and what urbanity means and what it means now to be quote unquote modern, not just in the technology, but in your understanding of the world and philosophy and reason and religion, and how all of these things are, tied together, and they're challenged by what quote unquote modernity is supposed to be.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 89. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or have authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Djèlí Clark about his book, A Master of Djinn. Born in New York and raised mostly in Houston, Djèlí Clark spent the formative years of his life in the homeland of his parents, Trinidad and Tobago. A Hugo and Sturgeon Award finalist, he is the author of The Black God's Drums and The Haunting of Tram Car 015. His short story, The Secret Lives of the Nine Negro Teeth of George Washington, fireside fiction, has earned him both a Nebula and Locus Award. Clark lives in Connecticut. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. Super excited to be with you today on this Sunday afternoon with Djèlí Clark, author of A Master of Djinn. Djèlí, say hello.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm really excited to talk about this book. It checks off so many boxes for me. So many adjectives have been associated with this book. And it's been interesting to see, whether it's steampunk or mystery or fantasy or history, kind of see how everything intertwines.
It's potpourri, is what it is. That last bit on Jeopardy. It's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so let's just kick it off, man. Give me the elevator pitch. What is this book all about to you?
So yeah, Master of Djinn is my return to the world that I first started in what is now called the Dead Djinn universe in 2016, with a short story by the name of The Dead Djinn in Cairo. And in this story, it follows the ever dapper suit wearing agent Fatma as she works for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities. And it follows a case that she's been put on where the most well known figure in the world, the most mysterious known figure in the world, Al Jahiz, who helped create this world of magic and steampunk and what have you that now exists, who had disappeared at one point, someone claiming to be Al Jahiz has returned. And it is
Hmm.
causing and sowing mayhem. And she's put on a case to basically try to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, and you already alluded to the fact that this is, not the first time you've dealt with this world.
Hmm.
So this is it's pretty unique. I think there's a lot of different stuff going on. So I'm really curious to know kind of how you came up with it, why this felt like a place you wanted to explore and build.
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back to that first short story where all I can say is I know, for instance, the opening scene of that story, Agent Fatma uh, in a room in a mystery with a dead Jinn and having to solve that mystery, that kind of grew into my mind, right? That was the
Hmm.
seed for a lot of this. But whenever I think back, what was going on around in my subconscious, I was adjuncting at the time, teaching a lot of world civ. I was teaching a lot about colonialism and anti-colonialism and post-colonialism.
Yeah.
And I think I was looking to create a story that spoke to those things through the lens of the fantastic, through the lens of a bit of alternate history, trying to imagine a what if. And
Hmm.
it just so happened this is the story that came out of, I suppose, all of that thinking. I always like to say this story erupted somewhere between uh, Edward Said's Orientalism and Pontecorvo's the film A Battle of Algiers.
Hmm.
Somewhere in the middle, this story came about, and once I started, it just seemed like a fun world to play in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you brought up something that I was really interested about is kind of making that connection between history and fantasy. And I know as I was
Hmm.
reading through this, I had my dictionary, my Wikipedia, I had everything handy to try and figure out like, okay, is this a real place? Is this a real person? Like
Right,
trying to
right.
educate myself a little bit. And a lot of times it is, and you have a lot of real historical characters, heads of state at the time, real buildings, and all that. So, how did you make those decisions about who you actually wanted to include and be a part of the story versus when you wanted to kind of veer into, giving yourself some license?
Yeah, because this was, first of all, it was alternate world, and I
Hmm.
guess as a historian, I tend to look at once you've gone down the road of the counterfactual, anything's possible,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I'm no longer dealing with the actual characters of our world and their histories. It's something else, right? It's automatically another place. And so, in that sense, automatically I have license, right? Because
Hmm.
I've already changed this world. And once I've added in elements of magic, well, then I can go in many different directions. And so, it was fun to play around with those things to, pull on figures and places, as you said, and events from this world, but then touch it with a bit of magic, right?
Yeah.
Or add a bit of the fantastic to it. And I think nearly whenever I brought up some event that may have occurred in our world, let's take, for instance, the scramble for Africa that most people learn about in school, right? The Berlin Conference in the late 1880s that decides they're going to carve up the African continent so that European powers aren't fighting over colonialism. In this one, I use that same scramble for Africa, but in this case, they meet because they fear the rise of magic has happened in Egypt could cause problems, right, and disrupt their imperial power. So that's why they decide to attempt to carve up Africa. And in this world, their attempts to do so go awry because we see places like Egypt and other places now have magic. And so whenever I would bring in some bit of history, it was always with the understanding that I'm weaving a bit of this fantastic behind it, a little bit of this alternate world. So, I'm not giving people a full history lesson.
That's right. Yeah, they
Yeah,
got to know.
yeah.
And the other thing that really struck me was that you're introducing people to this world and this culture. The book is set in Cairo, and the book is in English, but you also keep a lot of the Arabic. You keep a lot of the other
Hmm.
languages in there, and I feel like there's kind of two ways to read the book, right? For people that don't speak those languages, they can kind of just do their best and contextualize and infer and kind of move along through it, or they can stop and sort of try and actually like quickly look up or understand what particular things mean.
Right.
Even things around like clothing. As you describe all the various clothing people are wearing, that's not stuff that I was familiar with, and I stopped and tried to kind of learn a little bit about it. But how did you decide to make that decision where you really wanted to
Hmm.
keep some of those words in there that you knew not everyone might necessarily understand?
I suppose my thing with all of that is, I said I read Tolkien. I sure didn't understand Elvish, but I got through it. So I
Yeah,
figure
yeah, fair.
people can get through seeing different languages. And so in this work, I think I simply followed along that trend where, I simply used certain Arabic words and phrases with the understanding, of course, that I'm writing to a Western audience. I'm well aware of who I'm writing to for the most part. Yet, I wanted to make certain that I included not only bits of culture, but bits of the bits of language and other things that go along with this world. So, but
Yeah.
I'm glad that you were taking time to look some of those up.
I
Yeah.
felt like I had to, especially because I realized that that was going to happen a lot, and would be important to try and figure some of the characters out. I think.
Yeah, and I no, I was saying, I think that there's often a worry. It's been a worry. I know in previous time with editors, and I know writers have spoken about this, where editors have wondered, well, this might throw someone out of the story. They may not be able to keep
Hmm.
up if you use languages they're not familiar with. But again, thankfully, I didn't get that from Tor. They were quite happy. They actually
Yeah.
bought in Arabic speakers, Egyptian Arabic speakers. They even helped me get certain things right, so they were extremely helpful, and I didn't get any of that. And so I think it says something to the fact that we have readers that I wouldn't say they're more sophisticated. I think they've always been sophisticated enough to get this. Again, if
Yeah.
they can read works with Elvish and Klingon and made up languages and figure out what's going on. I mean, I love the Wheel of Time. I mean, how many glottal
Yeah.
stops are there
Yeah.
in
Robert
that
Jordan goes
language?
to town. Yeah.
Yeah, I said if you can do all that and make it through and know the difference between Maneferin and Tai Share and all that, then you can deal with real world languages. Yeah,
Yeah. Fair. All right. Well, let's hop in the book here. I want to try and talk through it because I mean, so much happens here, but maybe we already alluded to it a little bit with
hmm
some of the direction you went, but maybe try and help us understand the world a little bit. So for people that are coming into this, it's like, okay, we're in Egypt. Things
yeah,
are different though. There's magic. There's all these magical creatures. Maybe kind of walk us through a little bit of what that world is when we
sure.
start
I
out.
suppose the most important thing to know. I mean, in all alt world stories, there's always what's the point of divergence, right? Where in this case, this world looks a lot like ours. It's ours, and then something happens, and it's someplace else. And so
Hmm.
the point of the main, there are a lot of points of divergence, but the main one involves a mysterious figure by the name of Al Dahis, who 40 or so years before the events that are happening in Cairo in the book in 1912, 40 years before that, he uses a mix of alchemy and machines, and he basically opens up the doorways between the mundane world and the mystical, magical world. In places like Egypt, this means that Djinn now become corporeal. They flood into the world. There's the illusion that some of them had always been there, but certainly now they are out in the open. They have taken physical form, and they basically live and interact among human beings. And so,
Hmm.
because of them, they're great builders. So there's a great deal of architecture that they've built. That's a bit of steampunk, diesel punk, and other things. And because of their aid, this Egypt has thwarted attempts by Britain to colonize it. And by now, by 1912, it's become something of a world power because of this technology that is a mix of what we would think of as mundane science as well as magic. And Fatma, our main character here, she works for an organization called the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities that basically attempts to keep order, right, in a world where magic is now a part of everyday life and the supernatural is a part of everyday life. So she's like a mix between the FBI and I don't know, some X Files type group, right?
Yeah.
Agency that's trying to just make sure that the things don't spill over.
Yeah.
So this is the world that we're in here. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And we have Fatma, and then very soon on, we get introduced to her partner, Hadia,
Yes.
and Siti.
Yes.
And so we've got like this whole group, and we've got a fourth woman coming down the line later.
Yeah.
And so, I just noticed this story really contains a lot of very strong women characters. And as you describe in the book, around that time in Cairo, women were kind of just starting to be accepted
hmm
into various levels of society where they couldn't before, and it's touched on in different ways throughout the book.
Yeah.
And I was just curious to know why it was important for you to depict all these different strong female characters.
Yeah. I mean, some of it has to do with the main character, Fatma, who I'd first dreamt up. And I wanted to surround her by people that both challenge her and she challenges them. And so these characters kind of arose organically around her.
Hmm.
And then Fatima herself, probably because her her last name El Shari is taken from a famous Egyptian feminist, a real Egyptian feminist. That's why it's like a nod to that. And so, I mean, I always figure out, people always ask me like where these characters come from. So part of it again is building characters around Fatma, and then it probably comes from women that I've known in my life. I'm certainly pulling on some of them to create these characters, and they simply
Hmm.
fit, right? They fit the story in ways that when you're writing, like this character fits. This is who I want, and I really enjoyed, giving them the spotlight and seeing what they can do.
Yeah. And kind of in addition to kind of some of the maybe I'll say casual sexism that is displayed towards them throughout the book, there's
Yeah,
also very much outright racism
yeah,
displayed towards them and towards other people throughout the book in very interesting ways, I think. And
yeah.
maybe talk through. So I wrote down Abda and Abid
Adib. Yeah,
as terms to pay attention to, but maybe
yeah,
talk through all that and how this particular world you built is dealing with racism across species, across the types of racism we see every day. How is all that manifesting here?
yeah. So it's one thing. It's like I've seen it. I've seen the times people have talked about this world as a utopia, and I think that just says that. I think that just speaks to how much if you can give people a world that where the horrors of colonialism didn't occur as we know it, anything from
Mm,
that seems like a utopia, right? But in reality, this is not a utopia. What's happened here is this Egypt has just been given the chance to determine its own fate without imperial powers interfering, right? But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they are free of all of the problems that would have existed before the arrival of the British, the problems that would exist in any human society. And so, one of those issues are issues of race, there are issues of color, there are issues of inequity, there is gender discrimination, there are all of these things. And what I
hmm
try to show as a society, trying to work through it, right? A post-colonial without the irony of what post-colonial as a term normally means, but an actual post-colonial society trying to work its way through and deal with these things. Again, without the interference of other powers. And so one of those issues is race. And I was pulling probably on it. One of the things I like blending in here is taking a bit of our modern world and putting it into the past because why not? So there are little bits of slang and things that are probably much more modern that I put in there. And so one of the things I point out, for instance, is that there's the mention of a character who is slurred as an abid, and this is simply a term, a slang term that's actually used very much in modern day, hurled against people of darker skin, and it simply means slave, and
mm,
the way it's used anyway will mean slave, and it's considered derogatory by those who it's hurled against. And I wanted to highlight that to show that this is not a perfect world. In fact, there are
yeah,
some, as you know in the book, there are some figures from the United States who've gone there, some African Americans from New Orleans, and they
that's
remark,
right.
that they're so happy that they've escaped Jim Crow of the United States, and yet at the same time, there's this sobering reality. Well, this place isn't perfect. It may not be
Yeah,
Jim Crow, but it has its own issues. And so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't creating a Pollyanna-ish society, but I was simply showing a real one,
yeah, makes sense.
even with the magic.
And yeah, even with magic. Um, yeah, and so all those different points that you raised, all those different areas in which this world still has problems. Yeah, it's really interesting to see that when the imposter kind of comes back, this potential Al Jahiz kind of return, and all of our heroes are trying to fight against him. He ends up really getting the people on his side at the beginning there. There's
Yes.
there's preaching that happens, and he's pushing back against kind of modernity was my sense, and telling people that their souls are unfulfilled even if they have all these fancy gadgets. And at least that resonated with me a little bit
Hmm.
about kind of our world,
Yeah.
and trying to think about, hey, like, okay, I'm just looking here, I'm surrounded by gadgets, but to what extent is my soul fulfilled? Certainly not by them, but it's like it's something I still have to work at.
Right.
So I think it's just an interesting thought to think through. How are we different from them in that regard. How should we be thinking about trying to fill
Hmm.
our souls, which is, important given that we can kind of maybe stop paying attention to that and just play with our phones or whatever in the meantime.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's great the way you put that, because I think what this speaks of are issues that come about in each age, right? With
Hmm.
technological wonders, or simply what modernity brings. Like, just beyond regular technology, modernity, for instance, brings specific understandings of time, right?
Mm.
Because there are train schedules and there are different things. So even
Yeah.
the way people perceive time is different. You told someone you were getting somewhere, wasn't often specific, until modernity comes about and it was like, well, now we have trains, we have certain schedules, and things have to be ordered in this way. And a
Mm.
lot of this was me thinking through and pulling on the histories of what happens in the industrial world, right, with industrialization early on, and how that changes as people are moving from agrarian lifestyles and places and moving into these urban spaces, and what urbanity means and what it means now to be quote unquote modern, not just in the technology, but in your understanding of the world and philosophy and reason and religion, and how all of these things are, tied together, and they're challenged by what quote unquote modernity is supposed to be. And so I wanted to show a society where people are struggling with those things. Egypt has created all of these great technological wonders, but not everybody has been pulled along, right? It's not a world
Yep.
where everyone is benefiting equally. What happens when those technological wonders means that people are leaving rural villages and now coming to the city, right? Seeking work. What kind of factory work do they have to deal with? Like, what are the issues they have to deal with issues of labor? How does it how does this change them as they leave the understandings of the environment and their very understanding of how the world is supposed to work? Again, with something as simple as time, how does that change when they're in a place like Cairo? And so I wanted to get at the heart of that. Well, not at the heart of it, but I certainly want to make it part of the story. Again, to show that, these are things that human beings will always deal with, and they're always going to be part of the things we struggle with.
Yeah, and now that you're saying that, it kind of reminds me of I think I have them right. Was it 40 Leopards? What was the
Yes,
name of the group?
the 40
Yeah, so that
leopards.
it kind of reminds me of that in the sense that like early on in the book they seem a little like on the side of the people and anti-police and anti, Fatma and our hero here.
Yeah.
And as the book goes on, I think their allegiance maybe shifts a little bit. It's a little fluid. But also I think Fatma kind of comes to understand a little bit more about who they are, why they exist, and their purposes, and maybe they start to blend a little bit together in some interesting ways. So I thought that kind of connection, between towards what you were just saying, I think maybe makes a little more sense now.
Yeah, yeah, and the 40 leopards are they're a nod to a lot of things.
Hmm.
Um, there were, for instance, there was a group called the 40 elephants, a group of women. Uh, I guess you can call them women thieves, and who were in England, notorious. And so I kind of pulled on them for the 40 leopards, but I'm also pulling on the popular Western tale from the Thousand and One Nights of the 40 Thieves,
Hmm.
who they themselves may have, used in their understandings of their names. So I'm kind of playing around with that. But I also wanted to have them as these figures who are thieves, but they live among the disenfranchised, right? And the
Exactly.
impoverished.
Yeah.
And they see themselves as thieves, but they also see themselves as protectors of these societies. And so they actually, even as thieves, they bring up a lot of they lay bare a lot of the tensions in society that Al Jahiz is basically exploiting.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Totally.
yeah.
And one thing, just to kind of pause, because I think something I have a lot of other questions that are like
Hmm.
trying to get at like the depths of this book, and there's a lot of layers. But I also
Yeah.
do want to pause and take a step back and ask about kind of the like the drama and the action of the book, because you definitely went in a direction a couple times where it was like, this is like a big time action sequence, and we're having like epic battles and
Yeah.
fights, and really crazy stuff is going on, and that the magic enables a lot of intense destruction,
Yeah.
very quickly. So I thought that was interesting, and kind of, it's like a detective and action thing, and you get to go back and forth, and
Yeah.
so I'm just curious about how you decided to write the intensity and the action scenes, and is that something that you had done a lot before, or really decided here you were going to go big on destroying half of Cairo?
Right. No, I mean, I think I've played around with that before. I always like, every book has its mood. Like there are books
Mm,
where, or stories even, where you can read the story and not a lot happens, and that's fine, right? Because it's not that kind of story. But I think I'd set the mood with the last stories in this world to let people know that they are at once detective stories with this ministry, but they come across fantastic things that challenge them physically, right? That they're going to
yeah.
have to try to at times physically overcome. And so, this would not have been a story that would have been good if it was just Fatma sitting in a coffee shop talking in dialogue the whole time. And that works for some stories, but that wouldn't have worked here.
Yeah.
And at
No.
the same time, I didn't want to make it, a pulp book where you're like, oh my goodness, it's like action scene to action scene, and there's never a moment to slow down. Like, does anybody go to the bathroom
Right.
here? Because
Right. Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah.
they've
How
just
do they
been
take
going.
take a breath?
Yeah, it's not a Michael Bay film, right? Where things are blowing up all the time.
Yeah.
And part of that was just trying to, it was a thing where it's a bit of pacing and trying to figure out, okay, here's where I need to have a bit of action. And since I know at the end there's going to be huge action, right? I don't want
Yeah.
that. I don't want to, have scenes that are so big before that the ending seems like, oh, it's just another big action scene. And so I tried to build those in as long as I'm telling the story, right? So that they fit into the story, they make sense, and that people get a chance to slow down and breathe and fall into the world before there's another sword fight or something.
Yeah. That's right. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the interview so far. Heads up that there are spoilers up ahead. If you plan to read the book, skip ahead to 37 minutes and 40 seconds. Then, once you've read the book, come on back here for some more amazing conversation. Our heroes are kind of going around trying to unravel, figure out what's happening. They have interactions, there's fights, there's battles. Eventually they start to figure out some level of what's happening here. And,
Hmm.
Fatma starts to realize that this person is not who they say they are.
Right.
She was right with the imposter idea.
Hmm.
And, one major event in the story is when they go and visit a bookseller and start to uncover the secrets of this ring, right? Because the
Yeah.
book is titled "A Master of
Yeah.
Djinn," and these Djinn are being taken over by this imposter person and controlled. So they
Hmm.
start to understand how that happens, but you present that in a very interesting way where at first it's impossible for them to remember.
Yeah.
There's some crazy magic that's been woven, and we meet these like super interesting angel characters actually later on that were perhaps responsible. And but I just thought the way that you had that was really interesting, where it's like you couldn't remember it unless you really actively tried.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would just float away a few minutes later. And like our heroes keep forgetting, and then they have to have like pieces of
Yeah.
paper all around them, and they have to constantly remind themselves. And this is a problem they have to
Right.
solve in some way. So I kind of thought about that a little bit, and it's sort of like, I don't know, it felt very modern to me. This feels like a very modern problem where you have like
Yeah.
some important bit of information, but then there's just torrent, this deluge of information headed at you constantly all the time. And it's like, what was that thing I was just thinking about or
Yeah. Yeah.
remembering?
Right.
So I don't know. To me, it felt very modern. I'm just, I was wondering the extent to which that felt true to you as well. Like, I don't know whether it's like,
Hmm.
I don't know, social media or even just the news or whatever, kind of just throwing stuff at us constantly,
Yeah.
and it being very difficult to process everything.
Yeah, burying the lead in some ways, or yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. And in a way, I don't know if I had thought of that, but it's interesting. I can definitely see that understanding of it, that modern thing where it's hard to parse truth because you've got so much coming at you. And so in this case, the most important thing in this world, really, if I were to boil it down, is information, right?
Hmm.
Information basically makes this world work. And there are always secrets, right? And that's just part of the notion of magic, right? That magic is secret in its own ways. There's always things to unlock and things that are unknown. The Jinn themselves hold the thought of secrets. They don't tell everything, right? They
Yep.
are mysterious creatures. The so-called angels are even more so. They're completely enigmatic and hard to understand. And so one of the things that mortals are dealing here is like, how do we deal with all of the issues and secrets we have? How do we now deal with this? With the understanding that there are all these other worlds and things that we may not fully grasp, and that people are keeping some of this information away from us at times. And so I wanted to play around with this notion of uh, something of this notion of people being confounded and in the dark. And part of it was simply part of a way to tell this story. The notion of the Seal of Solomon is pretty popular and well known
Hmm.
within I would say not just Islamic but much of Middle Eastern um, cosmology and folklore. It's a well known story among Islamic and Judaic teachings. And so
Hmm.
if I were to simply bring it up and it's like, why hadn't somebody thought of that? Right? It would have been immediately someone like Fatima would have in this world would have known like, oh, somebody must have the Seal of Solomon. Right. And so part of this was me trying to figure out a way like, how do I make it so that she doesn't know this? Like, why wouldn't they know this? And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, what about some great confounding magic? Right?
Yeah.
Some
That's
way
smart.
that some way that information, especially for her ministry, should know all these things is kept away from them. And as I started thinking, I like knew, okay, this is how this is going to work. So part of that is just good old, I got to make this thing work,
That's
right?
right.
I need a
You got to
reverse
make the
MacGuffin
storytelling happen.
in
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
ways.
There it
I've
is.
got to make this thing work somehow because it wouldn't have made sense, right? That would have been an outsider's view who has never heard of the Seal of Solomon, but for people in that
Yeah.
world have been like, well, of course, everybody knows that story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Fair.
I had to take the story away, and I think that just and I mean it was enjoyable to do that because I got to bring back in the angels who also star in the first story, and bring them in a way that if people had thought they weren't going to be in there, how they show up,
That's right. They
right?
sure do.
Yeah,
Um, cool. Well, I also am curious. So, we talked at the beginning, you're a historian, you've done work on colonialism, and, you have a couple moments in the book where you describe what it's like for the jinn to have been enslaved,
yeah, yeah,
where they, talk about how they feel as if their, their mind was somewhere in there, but they weren't in control of their body, and,
yeah,
kind of how awful all that was. I guess, and then the big reveal of Abigail, right? Or even the fact
yeah,
that they thought it was Alexander. I mean, either way,
yeah.
it was presumed to be an English person,
Hmm.
that had come in and taken control and was up to no good. And so, there's just the clear connection to the
Yeah,
idea of colonialism and, what the great powers were doing at that time.
yeah.
And so I guess I just curious to know how you connected all that, with the way that you understand our world to be
Hmm.
and the way that colonialism played out and that slavery played out
Right,
towards the connection here that again that slave master to slave seems to
right.
have happened in a much more in a magical way, but in a way that is just as real to everyone in this book.
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I think part of it was my thinking, like, I think I say at one point in there, how, or what is the Jin story about the seal, right? How do they feel having something that controls them in that way?
Hmm.
And that was something I wanted to get at, where, and I think I've said before, the Jin here they abhor slavery, right, or anything like that because they've known it. And I think about even in the West, the popular stories of Jin as genies, right, who are they even use the term "I'm the slave of the lamp" or something of the sort, right?
Yeah.
Or I am now your slave. We in the West we had an entire TV show for in the 50s or 60s about a quote unquote genie who now becomes this guy's basically slave for eternity, right? Bound to them. And so I wanted to play around with that and figure out how might they feel about that and what may they think about this, and how something like that is something, the Seal of Solomon is something they don't want people to know about, because they fear being returned to that. And at the same time, I also play around. One of the ways that Al-Jahiz is able to often get at people is to strike at their fear that Egypt may lose its sovereignty, right? And he uses, this is very modern, he uses a lot of disinformation
Yep.
and basically false things and rumors and conspiracies to paint this notion that the powers that be in Cairo are actually might be in league with the English to basically recolonize, Egypt, and in that way use the metaphor of type of re-enslavement. And so part of this was me thinking, well, what if you have a state that is able to push off colonization like this? There's still going to be that latent fear, right? That what if we are colonized? What if we lose this freedom, right? Since there are still these imperial powers out there, how do we hold on to our freedom? And probably in my own studies, I know I was probably channeling someplace like Haiti, right? Haiti in 1804 defeats France and other Western powers, gains its independence, and then lives in fear, right?
Mm.
That at any point they can be reinvaded, right? And that slavery will return. It becomes this, psychic fear. And so if you want to pull on something, there that people will be riled up about, make them think, that foreign powers might be at any moment ready to come back and take them over, which wasn't so far fetched at all in Haiti's case. But I suppose I was thinking some of that when I was thinking of this modern Egypt, and that probably owes again to my own historical background, and that I study slavery and emancipation, and that I'm probably channeling the great C.L.R. James' work, Black Jacobins, which he writes in the 1930s, treatise on the Haitian Revolution. And what he's speaking about, though, however, is he's thinking of the coming anti-colonial movements, and he's
Mm.
saying Haiti will provide this template. What happened in Haiti, 130 years past, will provide the template of what is to come. And so, like I said, a lot of things are probably swirling around in my head as I think about those things. But certainly, I want to present an Egypt that is both boastful and prideful, but the memory of what colonization could wrought is still there in people's heads, and it's
Yeah.
still a threat that the rest of the world faces, even if they are finding ways to break free.
Yeah. No, that was super interesting to kind of notice those dynamics play out
Yeah,
across the book.
yeah,
Um, and it's just that's what I was saying. This book is great because there's so many layers. Like along with everything we've been talking about, there's also this like detective story that you play out, and they try and
yeah.
figure out clues, and they're kind of. But to me, that was like that was the I don't know, the skeleton or whatever. And so,
Yeah, the
um,
regular detective. I think people are used to that one.
right,
But I get to throw in magic and all these other things, and I get to talk about the other things that are happening in the world. So I can always, build up on different things that are happening in China or India, or so forth,
yeah,
just to get
yeah,
give people a little bit more, or the United States.
yeah, yeah. I thought even just yeah when they went to the what was the name of the club? They went
The
there
Jasmine,
and
the Jasmine, yeah,
Jasmine. It was just all sorts of
yeah,
interesting things happened there.
the
And
Jasmine, yeah.
yeah,
That's based on it's actually there because it's 1912. It's also my fervent wish that maybe I had done this in 1920 something, so I could be fully in the jazz age. And so
mm,
I'm now in the proto jazz age. And so they're musicians from New Orleans, and they say they don't call it jazz, just say they're doing the New Orleans sound.
right.
But the club itself is named Jasmine, which some believe that's where we get the very term jazz from
Oh, I
the
didn't know that.
jasmine
Oh, that's
perfume.
interesting.
That's at
Yeah.
least that's one of the theories. That's one of the
Hmm.
theories that jazz musicians have long said, that it may have come from the jasmine perfume that were popular in brothels of all places. This one I make it a jasmine spot has to do with tea.
That's right.
But
Little
yeah,
safer for the kids.
a little safe for the kids. But yeah, it's like again, it's interesting. It's always fun to bring in those little bits of history, those little tidbits
Yeah, for
here and there
sure.
to put into your world.
Yeah, there's lots of little nods like that
Yeah.
for people to take a look at. Well, all right, let's kind of wrap it up. Is there
Sure.
anything else that you really wanted to talk about or think through, or that you hoped people would get out of the book?
From the first time I wrote this short story, Dead Djinn in Cairo, I have been floored by how much people really like this world, and it's been the inspiration. In fact, it's the reason that there was then a novella, The Haunting of Tramcar 015, and it's why there's this book.
Hmm.
And so I am thankful to readers who read these things and get so much out of it because it's what's driven me to write more. When I wrote that first story, there was nothing else in mind. I had no inkling that there would be more in this world. And
Yeah,
now, thanks to readers, there is. So I just want to say I'm thankful for that.
sounds good. And I always like to wrap it up with a quick thunder round, some getting to know you questions, and we'll call it a
Sure.
day. Sound good?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Great.
First one, what is your favorite food and drink?
My favorite food is chicken and potato roti. And anybody wants to look up what roti is, it's think of a Trinidadian dish. It's spelled ROTI. It's my favorite food in the world, probably. My favorite drink, I don't know, rum punch.
Rum punch. Clean. Yeah, there's actually a ton of good roadie places right around here. I live in kind of central Brooklyn.
Oh yeah, yeah, you
So
know it. I don't need to tell you,
yeah,
man. You got
yeah,
it all. You got Gloria's, Ali's, you got everything.
yeah. That's like that's our food.
Yeah.
Number two, where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Favorite place I've ever been. Um, Tulum, Mexico.
Hmm.
Yeah. There was I came out one night and I looked out. I was off the ocean. I looked out the ocean and I saw stars like I've never seen them before. It was otherworldly falling into the
Yeah,
sea. I've never seen anything like that before.
yeah.
Love to see it again.
I got that feeling in a little island in Indonesia I was at once, and it's the same idea where
Yeah.
like there's a billion stars above us and we
Yeah.
never see them, and it's
Yeah. It was.
amazing to feel it.
Yeah. It was literally like a bit. It was amazing and frightful coming out to
Hmm.
look at it, like and just seeing dark ocean and all of these. I was like, did the world get transported to another galaxy? What's happening?
Yeah, right.
It was really
Ugh.
surreal. But yeah, it was
Um,
great.
all right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Ah, I should have looked up these questions before. Um, if magic wand and change any one thing, uh, I would want Wu-Tang to still make music.
Ooh,
That's what I
nice.
want.
Bring back
I
the
said, I don't want much. I want you
hip
guys
hop. Yeah,
to bring
I don't want
everybody back.
much.
I want everybody back, and I want them
Yeah,
all continually making
all
music.
members.
Yep,
Fair
everyone.
enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Djèlí Clark, the book is A Master of Djinn. Thanks so much for talking. This was a really great discussion.
No, thank you. This has been great.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.